Welcome to Ike Reads the News, the show where I read the news and tell you what I think about it. So this episode, I'm going to be talking about stimulus, specifically the fact that Biden proposed a $1.9 trillion stimulus package, and a group of 10 GOP senators submitted their own $618 billion proposal in response. And the short of it is that Biden doesn't need a single Republican vote for his stimulus to pass, but of course bipartisan support would be great. Of course, we want this unity. Additionally, if there are any non-spending bills in the future, it would need 60 votes to pass the Senate. And so if we were to get any sort of immigration reform in the next couple of years, for example, we would expect to see all of the people, or at least most of the people on this list. And so again, none of these senators are needed for the bill to pass, but they're really negotiating as if there needs to be this bipartisan support. And so the Republicans submitted this lowball offer that has a couple of non-starters for Democrats. Specifically, there's no aid for state and local governments, and the direct stimulus payments are much lower than what Democrats had campaigned on. And so it's interesting that instead of trying to talk about what's really important to them, they just submitted this lowball offer that's frankly a worse bill. The heart of the Republican argument is that the bill is too large and the debt would be bad for long-term growth. This sounds very similar to what Republicans were saying in the early 2010s when they were campaigning on the fact that controlling the national debt was of the utmost importance. Now that Republicans don't have power, we can expect to hear them feign austerity a lot over the next few years. But it's worth looking at what they did when they actually held power. In 2017, Republicans passed a major tax bill that lowered taxes for most Americans and dramatically reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. This is traditional conservative fiscal policy, which advocates for lower taxes to stimulate growth. However, even after this growth was taken into account, the Congressional Budget Office estimated it would raise the national debt by $1.9 trillion. This is fine because the national debt is less worrisome than most people think, but the short of it is that the Republicans decreased tax revenues without reducing spending, which would grow the national debt. At first glance, the two proposals look very similar with the same $1.9 trillion price tag. However, these numbers are a little misleading. The tax bill will almost certainly increase the national debt by more than this amount. This is because the bill had a lot of the cuts expire a few years short to look good on this Congressional Budget Office report. Conversely, the stimulus won't increase the debt by nearly $1.9 trillion once productivity gains are taken into account, especially thinking about how costly doing nothing would be, as an estimated 5 million additional Americans would fall into poverty. Most economists agree the government should spend countercyclically, or basically spending money when the private sector doesn't. The concept is that people losing their jobs always sucks, but it can spiral out of control if they also lose their homes or stop spending money so other people lose their jobs. Now, comparing the two policies, the tax bill cut taxes to stimulate productivity. It cost somewhere over $1.9 trillion and was passed in December 17 during the 8th straight year of economic expansion when the unemployment rate was right around 4%. On the other hand, Biden's stimulus plan is attempting to put money in people's pockets to stimulate growth. It would cost less than $1.9 trillion, much less depending on how effectively targeted it is. And it's being proposed when the unemployment rate is at 6.7%, with entire sectors not having any hope of recovery in the near term. Is this really a question of the national debt or a question of which way the money is flowing? In terms of what's actually in the bills, the Washington Post has a great article looking at the differences between the two proposals. And the biggest differences are in direct payments, aid to state and local governments, and unemployment insurance. And so there are really two main things going on with the difference in direct payments. The first is that Biden is proposing $1,400 checks, while the GOP is proposing $1,000 checks. The other difference is that Biden is proposing phasing this out at $75,000 per year of income, while the GOP plan is aiming to phase this out at $50,000. And I think this really highlights the shortcomings of the Republican plan. There are many Democrats who campaigned on $2,000 checks, so it's really hard to imagine direct payments being less than $1,400, which would add up to $2,000 with the last round of stimulus. On the other hand, targeting this payment would really put it in the pockets of the people who need it most. There are several Democrats advocating for a lower cutoff, and so why don't the Republicans really focus their attention on that aspect of it? Moving on to aid for state and local governments, this is again seeking compromise when there really isn't anything there. This was the main sticking point that held the last round of stimulus up for months. This is a non-negotiable for most Democrats, since one of the most widely accepted theories for why it took us so long to recover from the 2008 recessions is the lack of government funding, especially at the state and local levels. States can't deficit spend, so they're asking for aid since they are faced with decreased tax revenues and increased spending due to the pandemic. And the last major difference between the two proposals is an extension of additional unemployment benefits that are set to expire in mid-March. There are again two main things going on here. The first difference is that Biden's proposal would go until September, where the GOP plan would expire at the end of June. And I think this later date is really needed. The vaccine rollout has been slower than expected and will take us a while to fully recover from this. It's also a sore subject since we just went 5 months without additional unemployment between the previous two stimulus bills. The second major thing going on here is that Biden's proposal has $400 a week in extra aid, whereas the GOP proposal has $300 a week extra. And the GOP senators are rightfully saying that people on unemployment shouldn't be making more than people who work full time. However, Biden's plan also has an increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which would make this much less of an issue. Overall, unemployment insurance is the most effective way to stimulate the economy by targeting it to people who need it most. In terms of what will actually get passed, it will most likely be much more similar to Biden's plan. The two proposals are so different that it will almost certainly be passed through reconciliation. This process doesn't preclude bipartisan support, but it only requires a majority in both the House and the Senate to pass. And there are slim majorities in both chambers, but it is unlikely that any Democrats in the House will vote against this, since this round of stimulus is supported by about 68% of Americans, including 97% of Democrats. This means that Senator Manchin of West Virginia will most likely be the deciding vote, since he is the most conservative Democrat in the Senate. And so, in terms of what Senator Manchin wants, he's fine with the total price tag, but is uncomfortable with a couple of the specifics. The first is the amount of aid to state and local governments, and so this will probably just be negotiated somewhere in the middle. He wants the aid to be more targeted, so we can expect a strong push to lower the cutoff to qualify for direct payments. He's okay with raising the minimum wage, but has advocated for an $11 per hour minimum wage. And so Biden's proposal would also increase this yearly based on the increase in the median wage. And this is really important and should happen, just at the very least to follow inflation. But it would mean that the difference between a starting value of $11 versus $12 an hour would be extremely significant, since this benchmark might not change for decades. The last big thing he wants is some sort of bipartisan input. And so I don't think there's really any proposal that could earn 60 votes in the Senate by mid-March when the current unemployment extension expires. And Manchin has also said he wants something before then, so it will be really interesting to see which one of those concerns wins out. In terms of what should be done, there have been a few positive developments since recording the first part of this. The unemployment rate for January fell dramatically to 6.3%, and the CBO strengthened their forecast for economic growth over the next year. And I don't think these things really affect aid for state and local governments, unemployment insurance, the minimum wage, or really anything directly related to the pandemic, since they're very real inequalities, and these things will help the economy as we transition back to normalcy. I also think the large price tag is fine. The US has also been spending a lot more on stimulus than other countries, but that's because other countries, for the most part, have stronger social safety nets to automatically handle these shocks. And again, the national debt is much less important than economic growth. I think the biggest thing it does change is that direct payments should probably be smaller. This will be really interesting since many Democrats campaigned on $2,000 checks. At the very least, it will definitely give more credence to lowering the cutoff to receive this benefit. It also gives the government more flexibility to think about long-term growth. For example, a recent study estimated the government would have to spend about $2.5 trillion on clean energy in the next decade to put us on a path towards decarbonization. If the government is going to invest heavily now, it makes a lot more sense to help workers transition into the jobs of the future instead of subsidizing workers and oil and gas, for example. It is really going to be a question of how effectively can we get money to the people who need it and spend money on the things that will lead to continued growth.